Well, right now, well, it's very heroine-centric, and it's noticed that the villains are all homegrown. This is a perfect example of the homegrown, the staying in the native culture, the inward journey. I call it the labyrinth, because it might be a journey of many miles but one that doesn't stray far from the center. So you'll see a lot of heroine-centric characters, or heroines, I guess I should say. They tend to stay in similar settings in some cases, not always, but in a lot. The home environment, or a castle, or a palace, or they move around within the native culture. So that's the labyrinth. And House of the Dragons has almost Byzantine style labyrinth politics, where not everyone is who they say they are. So there's a lot of deception, and people that might be allies one minute are actually the enemy. And they had a scene, I don't want to spoil it. They had a scene last night of a great deception.
What if the truth came in a gel cap and we could just pop it in our mouths and forget about it? Well, it doesn't, and we can't. But we can laugh in the face of reality while plotting our survival. Welcome to the Truth Tastes Funny podcast. I am your host, Hersh, and if my guests can handle the truth, so can you. Open wide, folks. Here it comes. With me today on Truth Tastes Funny is Douglas Burton. Doug is a novelist and a storyteller, and we're going to talk about a couple of books today. But his newest book is The Heroine's Labyrinth, Archetypal Designs in Heroine-Led Fiction. And I'm really excited to dive into this today, because I love the blending of mythology and reality and our takes on strong female characters. And that's something that's of particular interest to Doug. So, Doug, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Hersh. I appreciate it. I'm glad to be here.
It's my pleasure to have you. So before we dive into the new book, tell me a little bit about your writing style and your passion for fact-based storytelling. And let's get into that a little bit.
Yeah, so my debut novel was a historical fiction novel about the Byzantine Empire. And I'm a Byzantine enthusiast, and there's a distinct missing category of Byzantine stories. Like if I asked you to think of a film that takes place in the Byzantine Empire,
right?
Really hard to come up with one. Now, they're very few and far between. It's kind of a weird thing. So I really wanted to write a book that introduced this amazing, almost fantasy style setting,
right?
But true to history. It's a true story about a Byzantine Empress Theodora. And
right, this is Faraway Bird, right?
This is Faraway Bird,
yeah.
The debut novel. And I wrote it, and the novel went on to win several awards. And while I was writing it, I ran into some issues with story structure and writing, which will lead to the next book.
Right. And when you mentioned Byzantine, it's funny, everybody knows the word Byzantine. They usually pair it with the word empire, and that's about it.
Right, yeah.
That's about it. You maybe have some kind of elaborate, like if I had to come up with a word to associate, I might say elaborate or gilded or something. I don't know what. But, and then I watched on YouTube, there are some videos related to it. There's a video trailer, and I loved the kind of atmosphere, as you say, like the whole, it takes what could be a dry story or a dry period or who knows what, and really brings it to life, really kind of infuses it with drama and excitement, but it's all based on something real.
Right. It's all based on the real history there. And it's kind of a funky history. It's a Roman Empire divorced. It's a very heavily Christianized empire. And there's kind of a mysticism to the Byzantine Empire. And it's very powerful. So, and it's the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. So there's a lot to set the table with. It's a very fascinating period of time. And I centered on one woman, the woman who had become Byzantine Empress Theodora, and told her story in a way that mostly fits all of the facts in her biographical background, and even reconciles things that are otherwise awkward to history. And I felt like I did what I set out to do with that book. So I'm very proud of it. And I hope as many people as possible get a chance to read it.
I hope so too. Now let's talk about Heroine's Labyrinth.
Yes.
Um, Archetypal designs in heroine-led fiction.
Right.
So
Yeah.
this is a craft book,
This is a
right?
craft book that I never intended to write. When I was structuring Faraway Bird and trying to structure Empress Theodora's life, like a memoirist, what do you include? What do you not include? What is the story here? What is the beginning and what is the end of this first book? I turned, like many writers, to the hero's journey. And I was like, I'm going to use the hero's journey. I'm going to organize the story beats and the structure and the character arc according to the hero's journey. And I was not unfamiliar with the hero's journey. I studied it for about 20 years intensely. I have vast notes where I've matched up story after story after story to the hero's journey. I've read Christopher Vogler's book. I've read Joseph Campbell's book. I did the work so that I could internalize this well enough to attempt to write it. And like the worst possible thing happened about a third of the way into the book, maybe a little bit more than a third, but early. I realized the hero's journey was absolutely not going to address the biographical issues in Empress Theodora's life. And this was a pretty devastating issue to me because it left me right back to where I started and nullified almost 20 years of research into the hero's journey right now, like in this book. So
Yeah.
I went to find a feminine equivalent to the hero's journey because, one of the criticisms is that there is a kind of a warrior orientation to the hero's journey and a male centrism to it. And I would even agree to some extent that that is true. But I was left in the end with the fact that the hero's journey wasn't going to work with my story. And so when I did research on like a heroine's journey, I did find many books out there, and some of them were very valuable and some of them helped, but none of them were concise and easy to use like the hero's journey was as a writer. There was so much stuff in there. It was so nuanced and so complex that it was very difficult to apply into writing. And so I decided I was going to take a step back, watch heroine-centric films and TV shows. I was going to go back and read heroine-centric novels, the classics, and there are plenty, and just see if I could come up with any patterns similar to like a hero's journey style pattern. And over a long period of time, ultimately 4+ years, I came up with an alternative model. And the more I worked on it, the more it became completely distinct from the hero's journey. And this is an alternative model that has its own beats, its own designs, its own arc and nuances. And I was able to use this model to write and complete Faraway Bird. And I was very excited about it. And when I got to the end, I had shared this with several other writers, and men and women alike were like, you need to share this with other people. And so I spent the last 5 years writing this book, fine-tuning it, doing additional research, all the way up to Barbie, and finally finished it. And I'm very proud that I have at least finished this first edition.
Well, it's interesting because, you started with the desire to emphasize heroic women.
Right.
And tell these stories, and then stumbled upon the notion that the hero's journey in itself has an alternative, that it isn't just, from what I gather, it isn't just that a woman's journey is different from a man's.
Correct.
It's an entirely new paradigm for
Yes.
storytelling around heroism and the hero's journey as we understand it. So tell me a little of because one of the things we talked about this before the show, one of the challenges is, you come up with something new and you tell people you have something new and they don't believe that it's new because there's nothing new under the sun. Right. That's the thing. So dig into a little bit what you've discovered here about, because I'm also a writer, and as a writer of fiction and now nonfiction, but I totally, not a novelist, but I've written, some films and some TV and others, mostly in script form.
Right. So screenwriting.
But it's still, mostly screenwriting, but it's storytelling. nonetheless. And the beats are always, we're raised as, whether we go to film school or we're studying the craft, we're raised to believe that there's a certain beat, there's certain acts, there's certain things that have to happen. There are certain inciting events that have to, occur. So in your paradigm, what's different?
So the main distinction, I would say, between the hero's journey and the heroine's labyrinth is that the hero's journey is defined, in a sense, by a departure and a return. In fact, Joseph Campbell's work has a 3-act structure, and Act 1 is the title, Departure, and Act 3 is Return. And so you get the circular journey where the hero departs the native culture, goes into an underworld, and then returns with the boon. And there's a lot of steps along the way. Most of us are somewhat familiar with that, that circle. I realized very quickly, one of the earliest observations of the heroine-centric journey is that they don't always feature this departure and return from the native culture, that it is an inward journey into the native culture. And I would define it as, instead of a departure and return, more of an immersion into the native culture and a rearrangement of the native culture, meaning something changes socially in their arc of their story, whether it's something small, maybe something in the household is changed, or something at the highest level would be a revolutionary, total overturn of the social order, like in Hunger Games, for example.
Yeah.
So an inward journey is fundamentally and existentially different than an outward departure. And this difference began to start to set the stage for for my ability to identify other things that really were different from, or not even addressed in the hero's journey at all. For example, villains. Between the two models, a hero's journey villain is an archetypal distant dragon. It is usually a militant outsider, some being who threatens the native culture with annihilation or subjugation, and the hero confronts this villain. They're out in the open. They're basically saying, "Come at me, bro." It's the Emperor, it's Darth Vader, it's Thanos, Grendel. It's a militant outsider villain, often reptilian, alien, foreign, hostile, insect-like. It could be anything, but usually it's this outsider factor, and it must be slain, this dragon. And the hero usually confronts this distant dragon in single combat. That's very typical motif. Villains in so many heroine-centric stories just did not match that type of description. And so the archetypal design that I use to describe the villain in heroine-centric stories is a masked minotaur at the center of this labyrinth. So the masked minotaur is identifiable because they are duplicitous. They have a benevolent outward appearance. They're usually social apex characters, respected, esteemed, and even loved or believed in. And then yet they hide a tyrannical, cruel, and oppressive side that is not visible to everybody. And the heroine will identify this in this character, and then they will have to unmask this character, not just slay them in combat. You have to reveal this character often in these stories. And I think the experience of going up against a villain that not everyone sees as a villain is so fundamentally different than confronting someone mano a mano in combat, in two alphas, and attempting to defeat that villain.
So this is essentially the mother-in-law.
Well, in Tangled,
right?
Right. Or in Titanic, it's Cal Hotley. He's got social prestige. He's a social apex character. He's dashing in one scene.
Billy Zane's character.
Right. He's giving her a multi-million-dollar diamond and saying, professing his love. And then 5 minutes later in the story, he's striking her and wagging a finger and telling her what it means to be his wife. You will follow orders. And then the next scene, he's dashing and, apparently beloved by society. These are very specific villains that heroines are up against. And that is it's a fundamental difference in what they're dealing with in terms of who the villain is and how to deal with this villain. And there's different lessons there. They're homegrown. These people speak your language and know the social rules, in fact, have mastered the social rules. And usually it's the heroine who is at odds, because the masked minotaur can even muster social forces against the heroine if need be, and that does usually happen later in the story. You think of
It's
like Belle
interesting.
in like Beauty and the Beast. You've got Gaston. He's the masked minotaur. He's the social apex character, beloved by society. The ladies swoon. The men want to be like him. But in the end, he's a murderous individual. He
Right.
musters the villagers to storm the beast's castle, and he's willing to kill and murder people by the end of this, even in a PG film like this. So it's the masked minotaur is essentially half man, half beast. That's why I chose this name for the archetype, because he has, beast-like characteristics and human-like characteristics, but humanity is the beast's disguise. That's like one of the key elements.
But now we see in, literature and popular culture, we've seen this archetype before. It's not,
Yes.
you just were citing a couple of examples. So it's not like that archetype doesn't exist in the constructs that we've seen, who wasn't part of the typical hero's journey as we had learned it, I guess.
Correct. So I want to make a couple statements. One, I didn't invent this. I found this existing in these stories. So what I'm trying to do is articulate the patterns that I found in a way that's useful to other writers. That's specifically what I'm trying to do. And because no one had articulated it, that's why I wrote all this stuff. I was like, I've never read this exactly anywhere, so I'm going to write these things down. And the more I share this with other professional writers, the more people are like, oh man, I think you should try to lay this all out. And that took a way longer time.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you write nonfiction. These things can really grow into a life of their own. I'm sure you experience that.
Well, it reminds me of, making documentaries. It's like when people set out to produce documentaries. My wife produced documentaries for many years. It's dynamic because it isn't like a screenplay for a Marvel film where they know what the beginning, middle, and end is. They're on a journey as well.
Totally.
And they're filming, and it takes a turn, and it goes this way and that way, and that can be very exciting. I'm interested to know what led you to be involved in literature and writing to begin with, Doug.
Well, I've always had a love of literature. And I would say somewhere around 2008, I was always an amateur writer. A lot of us start that way. We write, we don't finish. We have a, treasure trove of unfinished stories where we excitedly share the first 8 chapters, and then we lose interest in it, or we don't know what we're doing. And when I made up my mind that I was going to do this for real, I started an entire process of reading all the classics. And I would read almost 2 books a month, sometimes one, depending, like something like Crime and Punishment. You don't blow through that. You gotta take your time and really understand it. And then there's Anna Karenina, and all the classics. I remember Lord of the Rings was another one that I had not read. I knew the story, but I realized I never read it. So I was reading about, on average, 2 books a month, sometimes more, sometimes less, and you start to develop a backlog, a library in the back of your head of all these different characters. And it's exciting. I realize why these stories are so well known. I remember reading Moby Dick at one point, just being like, wow, I feel the adventure of this story. This is so different from my normal life. It's unbelievable to, this story of being deep out at sea, and then there's this giant beast out there, and you are dealing with this beast on the high seas. So there's something special about reading. And I'm also a movie guy. I love watching movies and the TV shows, and like Game of Thrones and Star Wars and all that. So, I have a pretty heavy background in all of that, just from a passion. And I, really didn't realize how much of it you call upon when you're writing your own stuff. It's kind of funny. I'm writing about a Byzantine empress, but there are things from, Star Wars that I'm calling upon to put a scene together, which it doesn't sound like it would work, but it does,
Yeah. What are you watching? House of Dragons?
Yes, I just watched episode 2 last night.
Yeah, me too. So what's your take on it? What are you seeing in it?
Well, right now, it's very heroine centric, and it's noticed that the villains are all homegrown. This is a perfect example of, so the homegrown, the staying in the native culture, the inward journey, I call it the labyrinth, because it might be a journey of many miles, but one that doesn't stray far from the center. So you'll see a lot of heroine-centric characters, or heroines, I guess I should say, they tend to stay in similar settings in some cases, not always, but in a lot. The home environment, or a castle, or a palace, or they move around within the native culture. So that's the labyrinth. And House of the Dragons has almost Byzantine style labyrinth politics, where not everyone is who they say they are. So there's a lot of deception, and people that might be allies one minute are actually the enemy. And they had a scene, I don't want to spoil it. They had a scene last night of a great deception.
Yes, yeah.
You're right. So, the compromising of the inner sanctum. I call it home as battleground, which is something that usually takes place in which is astounding. When you start to look for it, you'll start to see it.
Yeah.
And even in stories like Aliens or Titanic, where the heroine is essentially leaving, her native culture kind of comes with her and surrounds her and is still occupying that interior space. But House of the Dragon is a classic home as battleground. There are murders inside the home. There are people compromising what is supposed to be the safest places of your native culture. So home is battleground.
Yeah. And they talk about Westeros as though there really isn't anything beyond that world. There's the Seven Kingdoms. It is a labyrinth. It is exactly that. In Game of Thrones, deception was constantly a part of the program. And I think that and I bring it up because you mentioned it, but I also happen to have just watched. I also watched Hunger Games the other day.
Oh yeah,
because my 9-year-old she's like obsessed with it. She's watched all the Hunger Games, yeah, and so we watch it periodically, and it's very interesting to look at all of these female-led films, casts, books, and to see the differences in the personalities of the hero versus heroine, even within the same story. There are male figures in each of these stories that are heroic. There are those that are villainous. There are those that are weak. In Hunger Games, how would you describe the President Snow, the late great Donald Sutherland, the President Snow villain? Where does he fit in?
Well, he's a masked minotaur. He's not only a social apex character, he's like the social apex character. He's the leader of the native culture. And her battle is with her native culture. And what's interesting is I actually describe it in the book as the labyrinth, as a lot of these stories take on a game board-like feeling. And I was trying to describe the relationship between an action heroine such as Katniss Everdeen and, let's say, like Jane Eyre, society. And, you have all there's cultural rules and regulations and guidelines and social norms and gender roles. All of these things are there to steer and direct behavior. And I feel like that's the relationship between a sociocultural labyrinth and an actual game board, which is the most overt manifestation, an actual labyrinth. We see Katniss Everdeen navigating a war-torn urban environment like a game board. And there's places, and they literally call it the Hunger Games. So she is navigating a labyrinth in a game-like scenario in the most overt way. And President Snow is your masked minotaur. He is a social apex character that she believes is hiding things and has an oppressive other side. And she's going to have to confront them. And the rearrangement in this case, is a revolutionary overturning of the social order. She's a revolutionary figure. So she's not vying to make one small social change like in some stories, or bettering the household in a family environment. This is like we're going to start from scratch. And it's our heroine that leads us there.
Now what is, as we kind of circle back around to the big picture of what you've been creating and conveying here, what's the next step for you in this big picture of creating these books and chronicling the archetypes that you've discovered? What's the next phase in your plan, in your master labyrinthian plan?
Yes. Yes, yes. Right now, the plan is to tell people about it, to share this. My goal, and this is important with any project, to come up with what is your mission statement here? Why am I doing this? Am I trying to provide social commentary? What am I doing? Why bother? Why am I spending so much time of my life working on this? And the answer was to help other writers. This became useful to me as a writer, and it was new and different and solved, God, countless issues in the structuring of a story with this alternative model. And so I decided that what I really want to do is help other writers. It's the one thing I'm qualified to do. I can talk to a writer to writer. I know what it is to try to work on these things. I know the pitfalls as a writer. I know the pitfalls of trying to organize stories. I have friends who are novelists and screenwriters, and even RPG role-playing characters. I have found that a surprising number of people who like archetypal designs to help them design role-playing stories. And then also memoirists. I have read numerous articles where memoirists rightfully complain that the hero's journey is not helping them write their memoir. And so part of me is like, maybe this will help you. So I'm not making the claim that this is a one-size-fits-all. I'm not making the claim that this is a gender exclusivist model. I've discovered it by studying heroines, but there are numerous male stories that follow the heroine's labyrinth, even like really manly stories like Rambo, Fight Club, The Godfather.
Right.
These are heroine's labyrinth structures. So my goal as a writer is to be helpful to other writers and share this with as many as I can. And if it helps them, then I've completed my mission. And if it doesn't help them, then that's okay too, because this won't work for everything. It's meant to work for people who need it.
Now, because now that you've kind of opened my mind about what the applications are of what you're doing, are you actively consulting with, are you pursuing that, consulting with, video game companies, with writers, as a business?
Well, that's a great way to look at it, actually. I really like that. What I'm doing right now is I'm trying to introduce the idea. And this is a very slow process because there's different personalities, and sometimes there's someone who goes, "Oh my God, I see what you're talking about. I get it." And they'll take that football and they're off and running. And then other people are like, "Well, let's slow down and think this through." A skeptical response, which I welcome. In fact, some of the most diehard skeptics have become some of the best supporters. And then there are some people who are just outright hostile. Who are you to say this? And it's like, that's fine too. So I have Christopher Vogler endorsed this book. I have had many conversations with him. He's been a great ally in all of this. And I'm working with an entertainment company in California to create like videos to teach this. And I'm also working with someone from Brandeis University in the Women and Gender Studies department in looking at this and including this as something that's contributing to the universe of ideas behind a heroine's journey at the very least. So I think once you can establish some credibility and get more social proof, as they call it, it gets easier to take that next step to do what you're describing, which is to treat this more as a business, as something that we can present and offer in this way or that way, in a variety of different ways.
Fantastic. And where can people find you, Doug?
You can find me on my website, which is douglasaburton.com. There is a brief overview of more of the archetypal designs there. There's a great video on the website, which goes through the labyrinth, just describing the labyrinth. And I have numerous examples of films that you can look at and see as I'm describing it, which makes it hard to miss in the future, to give you a little taste of kind of the joy of discovering archetypes in multiple different genres and stories. And sometimes I make appearances on YouTube on Table Talk channel. We'll discuss stories and films and break them down in numerous ways, and one of them being the Heroine's Labyrinth. And lately, I've also been appearing on Retro Nerd Girls channel for the same thing, to discuss films.
Thanks so much for tuning into Truth Tastes Funny. If you enjoyed the experience, please leave a 5-star review and share this podcast with your friends.